Beyond the Bell, Bloomberg's comprehensive cross-platform coverage of the U.S. market close starts right now.
And right now, we are 2 minutes away from the end of the trading day. Romaine Bostick, Caroline Hyde, Kailey Leinz in for Taylor Riggs, counting you down to the closing bell. Here to help take us beyond the bell, it's our global simulcast partners, Carol Massar, Paul Sweeney in for Tim Stenovic, bringing together our Bloomberg Television, radio, and YouTube audiences on a day that has been both sad and, to a certain extent, amazing, Carol. To see the market reaction here coming out of the gate early this morning at 9:30 in deep bear market territory on the NASDAQ, and now, based on the pricing we're looking at right now, up 3.2%, one of the best days that we've seen on the NASDAQ going back to March of 2021.
Yeah, pick out some of those big technology names, whether it's Facebook. It's up 5%. It hit a 52-week low yesterday, up 5% today. Google's up 4%. Microsoft, Paul, is up about 5%. We are seeing investors move into those big tech names.
Yeah, I want to quote from a note I just got from Vince Signorella, Bloomberg's markets correspondent here. Many traders today are comparing this to the first Gulf War, when risk-taking rallied back soon after the fighting began. So perhaps Street saying this might be short-term in duration.
It depends, of course, where sanctions go next. This has been a drip effect, and the turnaround, the risk reversal turnaround, all occurred after, of course, President Biden came out with further sanctions, but sanctions that many had worried would go even further, that would completely block Russia from access to the US dollar, to the yen, to the euro. And thus far, it doesn't feel as though the market was getting anywhere near that sort of anticipation.
Yeah, so maybe a sigh of relief, but it also is kind of the reverse when you look at some of the action in oil, Romaine, based on President Biden's comments around energy, around the idea that he will be looking for alternative supplies should there actually be any disruption in terms of energy flows out of Russia. He's trying to protect the American consumer at the pump, and you saw that reflected in oil prices.
Well, it would be interesting to see how effective he is, because remember, before this Ukrainian crisis boiled over, all the concern was about inflation and whether it was being contained, whether the Fed would be able to fight it. You're looking at a Dow Jones Industrial Average that is green. In fact, we're green across the screen here. It is higher by about 91 points, or about 0.3%. We should point out, from peak to trough on the Dow Jones Industrial Average, we moved about 1,000 points today.
Wow.
The S&P 500 had a similar dramatic move. It was down, of course, a couple percentage points. It's now closing higher by about 1.5%, or 63 points. The NASDAQ Composite up 436 points, or 3.3%, after being down about 3%. And even the Russell 2000 got in on the action, higher right now, Carol, by 2.6%.
Yeah, 100-point swing just on the Russell alone, and that's a big move when you're talking about those small caps. Hey, listen, not to be a bummer on the market, but NASDAQ 100, folks, still roughly down about 16% from its all-time high. S&P down about 11% from its all-time high, and the Russell is down about 18% from its all-time high, guys. So not to be a bummer, but just a little perspective here.
Right, it's one day in a series of days for this market that have been really quite extraordinary. But to the point of the tech outperformance we're seeing, you do see that reflected on a group basis. Looking beneath the surface of the S&P 500, your outperformers, semiconductors, software and services, each of those groups actually up more than 4%. What's interesting is at the bottom, you have a lot of the cyclicals, banks down 2.6%, energy also in negative territory with that rolling over in oil prices that we saw. And Romaine was talking about this earlier. Consumer staples also taking a hit. Food and beverage, one of the laggards here, because there is a lot of concern out there, of course, about inflation, Carol.
Yeah, inflation hasn't gone away.
No.
Right.
Yeah.
No, it has not at all. And, if these tensions exist, this could be even tougher inflationary numbers going forward. And that's why we've got to keep a watch on it. Kailey, I'm glad you mentioned financials, because I was watching that group. Those big banks really got hit hard. And we did see, I'm just going to pull out one. Citigroup was down about 4%, well off its lows of the day, but still under pressure. I didn't know if you saw this, but Citigroup became the first major U.S. bank to fully eliminate overdraft fees. So I think everybody's keeping an eye on that. Moderna, we saw it top in the S&P and the NASDAQ 100, signing $19 billion worth of agreements for this year for sales of its COVID vaccine. That's up a little bit from its forecast back in January. That stock was up 15% in today's session. Want to mention Live Nation. We talked about them, I think, a little bit after the close yesterday when they reported. That stock was up 10%, so a big gainer, certainly. And they talked about really having expectations for a really good year this year. And I do want to mention Booking Holdings. They also reported last night, not such a great day. So they were one of the decliners, down about 7% here. And the company, even though it showed some resiliency, we did see some pressure there.
And Carol, I want to go to global macro movers right now. favorite function, GMM. It's important to show you the markets that are closed as well, though, today, because this just shows you the size of the scale of the swings that we saw. Look at the pressure in equities over in Europe on the day. We saw Greek equities off by 6%, in particular Austrian equities off by 7%. The impact that we saw on Hungary, on Poland, of course, this is where we worry about the overall Ukraine effect and how that might spread into the rest of Eastern Europe. So real risk aversion as we entered trade, but then suddenly the US powers through. Nevertheless, we still see a US dollar that continues to power up 0.8%. Even as we question how far and how fast the Federal Reserve will now go, 0.8% higher. We see the British pound off by more than a percentage point there. You see Asian currencies dipping, Singapore dollar off by 0.7% there. We speak also of what's been happening for commodities, extraordinary moves. When you think of a strong dollar, you don't usually then see nat gas up 51% over in Europe. We saw, of course, natural gas in the UK trading up 51%. Shock, awe, fear. What does this mean in terms of ramifications, sanctions from Russia to Europe, and indeed what happens to the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline? Wheat, we know Ukraine, Russia, key exporter, up 4% as well. But overall, we also see a flight to safety. We continue to see that in the US, but we saw it in Europe in particular. Italian yields down 14 basis points. German yields on the 5-year down 8 basis points, Romaine.
Yeah, and some of that is still sticking. I mean, we did see some of those trades get dialed back, but you talk about the move that we saw. The 10-year yield had dropped at one point more than 14 basis points here. It's only down a couple basis, about 2 to 3 basis points at the moment. A lot of the activity, though, I thought this was interesting, was actually in that belly of the curve, in that 5-year yield. That's still down about 5 basis points right now. It was down as much as 16 basis points. And I think when you talk about this idea, as we've been talking about a lot, is the idea of how high Treasury yields can go. This idea that there was this unfettered move higher. And we're always reminded that whenever there's sort of ructions in the market, whether it's geopolitical or otherwise, people always tend to come back to one big thing, and that's the safety of U.S. sovereign debt.
I was thinking about Tina. There is no alternative, right? And we just had Yakov Arnopolov over at PIMCO talking about emerging markets. Like, when there is concerns about the outlook, where do investors largely come to? We've seen them going back into the dollar. We see them going back into U.S. assets. And so I guess when we think about the markets, obviously we've got to think about it in the context of what is going, Paul, around everywhere, and where ultimately investors are going to feel comfortable when there are so many questions out there about the outlook.
Yeah, and one of the areas that they're comfortable in is big tech. We have the NASDAQ up 3.35%. The NASDAQ 100, which is even a little bit more techy, 3.44%. So a good move in tech. That's where a lot of investors are finding some comfort here.
Well, and Paul, I am deep in the terminal right now trying to find the last time we have seen a turnaround in tech of this size. And I would note we've seen a number of these huge intraday reversals just in 2022. This isn't a today alone story. I mean, we saw this index down more than 4% one day in January to close in positive territory. This is obviously an even bigger intraday move of about 6 percentage points. I mean, we are talking swings that we haven't seen even in decades, Caroline. It's really quite remarkable.
Where's the superlatives when you need them? Meanwhile, gold.
I'm looking.
Exactly. Well, what was interesting is the other, we still see the lingering effects in U.S. Treasuries, as you were saying, Romaine. Yeah. But gold actually did lose some luster as we saw it up on the day and now currently down back to 1,899. It was interesting that haven got sold off.
Interesting that haven got sold off. Some of the gains that we saw on the dollar held on. And you know what came back? Bitcoin, believe it or not. Yeah, it was down pretty significantly. It's only up a couple percent right now, up about around that 38,000 level. But, of course, there was a lot of people talking about when does digital, no, I was going to use your phrase, digital gold. But when do cryptocurrencies really start to sort of flex as a hedge? And, there's a lot of concerns about the correlation to risk assets and whatnot. Maybe that correlation's still there. Maybe that's why we saw a rebound on the back of that rebound that we saw in equities.
Yeah, I'm sure Tom Keene's going to lead with that Bitcoin call tomorrow morning. But I'm just looking at the currencies. The ruble off almost about 3% here, so people getting out of the ruble. And the DXY index strength again, safe haven U.S. dollar DXY index up about 0.9% right now.
Yeah, and look, obviously we've been focused a lot on, of course, the tragedy to a certain extent. Let's just call it what it is in Ukraine right now. We are still focused on the markets, and we are still getting earnings. It's still earnings season out there, and we are getting a few crossing the wire right now. One of those companies is Coinbase. We were just talking about Bitcoin here. Those 4Q numbers coming in. Their revenue numbers did beat $2.5 billion. The street was looking for $2 billion on average. EPS also beat $3.32 versus $1.62 that the street was looking for here. Some of the monthly transaction numbers also higher than expected, 11.4 million versus 9.8 million. And the trading volume also elevated as well. The share is down a little bit here, not quite seeing the reason why, but overall it looks like they beat on most of the main metrics.
Yeah, I guess it's just a question of whether investors really want to hold some of these riskier related equities, even if we did see some of that buying of the dip today, Carol. Tomorrow is another question.
Yeah, exactly. Did you guys also, speaking of crypto, see it as maybe the new tool for billionaires who are looking to avoid sanctions?
Oh, don't say it.
Why? It's on the
We'll be
Bloomberg
talking about it after
terminal.
this.
I can say it.
Can you say that?
I can
You're like
say
Phil
it.
Mickelson.
All right, I can't wait for
say
tomorrow,
the
guys.
quiet
That's all I'm
parts
going to
out loud.
say, and it will be Friday, right? Okay.
Yes,
we're going to get through it. All right, that's going to do it for our cross-platform coverage on radio and TV and on YouTube. We call it Beyond the Bell. We'll see you again, same time, same place tomorrow.